Hi everyone, and you're very welcome to today's Saturday session for Junior Cycle Science, and our focus for today is going to be around the topic of ecology. So throughout today's session we're going to look at all of the main points which underpin the topic of ecology, and we're also going to look at a couple of exam questions which have come up in the past, just so we can see how we can apply our knowledge of ecology to the exam situation and make sure we can pick up as many marks as possible. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is a definition of what ecology actually is. And ecology is the study of the way living things and their environment both work together and interact with each other. So when we look at living things there, we're going to be looking at our plants, we're going to be looking at our animals, seeing how they work together, how they interact with each other, and it's all of those interactions that give us the definition of ecology. Now, really important, we're going to be focusing in on a habitat, because a habitat study is one thing which you have to do before the end of third year. You might have done it already. If you haven't, you will before you finish your junior cycle. Now, the habitat study is going to take place in a place where an organism lives. That's what we mean by a habitat. And we have lots of different habitats. We can have deserts, we can have meadows, grasslands, oceans, forests, we can have woodlands. And each one of those individual habitats will have a characteristic that make it that habitat. And they will have certain organisms, both plants and animals, that will live within that habitat. But the habitat, just to remember, is a place where an organism lives. An ecosystem then is a place where all living organisms work together and with their surrounding environment. So where we mentioned earlier on about the habitat being the natural home of the organism, an ecosystem is actually focusing on the interrelationships between the living organisms and the non-living environment. And we're going to be focusing on the environment, the non-living environment, in a couple of minutes. So just remember, the habitat is the natural home. The ecosystem is focusing on all the relationships between the organisms and then with the environment as well. Ecosystems then are made up of both living and non-living parts. So any living thing that affects ecosystems are called the biotic factors, whereas the non-living things that affect ecosystems are called the abiotic factors. So if we have a look at the table down here, we can see some examples of both living and non-living factors that affect the ecosystems. So the biotic factors will be things like competition and predation, whereas the abiotic, the non-living factors, will be things like the weather and the soil. So how does competition affect an ecosystem? Well, when we talk about competition, we're talking about a struggle for resources in short supply. So what do animals compete for? Well, they're going to be competing for food and for mates. So that's living things affecting the ecosystem. Plants are going to compete for space, for water, and for light. Okay, so again, this is a living thing affecting the ecosystem. Predation, this is where a predator just being an animal that kills and eats another organism, that's where they hunt their prey. So this is going to control the number of organisms that might be in an ecosystem. But again, this is a living factor that affects the ecosystem. So it's a biotic factor. That was predation. Some non-living factors that affect the ecosystem. Well, weather, so temperature and light can affect photosynthesis. So that's how the plants make their own food. And climate can actually also influence the migration of organisms on Earth. So at particular times of the year, you might have certain organisms that will actually move or migrate to different areas where there might be more food or more shelter or more mates. Again, this is a non-living thing. Weather is non-living, but it's still affecting the ecosystem, so it's an abiotic factor. Soil is another abiotic factor, so this impacts on the type of plants that can be grown. So some plants are going to prefer more acidic soils, others would prefer drier soils, but again, it doesn't matter if we're looking at soil pH, soil moisture content, or soil temperature, or even soil type. Soil is non-living. It's still going to affect the ecosystem, so it's an abiotic factor. Now, I mentioned earlier on about how through the course of your junior cycle studies, within the biological world element, you're going to be conducting a habitat study. And throughout that habitat study, you would have used various pieces of equipment to collect different animals and plants. We then would have used a key to identify them. But in the first place, how are we actually going to collect these organisms? Well, here we have 4 different pieces of equipment which can be used. We have a quadrat, we have a sweep net, we have a pitfall trap, and we have a pooter. So we're going to go through each one individually. You mightn't have used them all, but if you haven't, we'll explain now how they're used anyway. So the quadrat, we can see here, it's a square shape. Some quadrats will just have the outer frame. Other quadrats will also have individual squares inside, so it'll be divided up into smaller squares rather than just having one big square frame. So the quadrat is going to be randomly placed onto the ground, and a really good way to make sure that it is random is to stand and throw a pencil over your shoulder. Now, the reason we throw it over our shoulder is so we can't see where we're placing it. But the reason we throw a pencil instead of the actual quadrat, if we throw a quadrat, we could seriously hurt somebody, whereas by throwing a pencil, there's less risk of actually injuring somebody. And then once it's thrown, we can place the quadrat wherever the pencil is. So the number of species of each plant and animal inside the quadrat frame will be recorded using a key. So we want to be able to identify what they are, first of all, using the key, and then record the number of them that are present. A sweep net, this is used to collect small insects. So you will brush the net through long grass or tree leaves. Again, the smaller insects will be picked up, and you can use a key once again to identify whatever organisms are there. The pitfall trap, which you can see here, so we can see there was a hole dug into the ground and then there was a trap set into the ground, so it could be a plastic cup. So a small hole is dug into the ground, a cover is going to be placed on top, ensuring it is raised enough so that small animals and insects can crawl under. So this cover might have a couple of stones around the hole. The cover will be placed on top. There'll be gaps between the stones so the animals or the insects can walk between the stones, but then they're going to fall once they get as far as the trap. They won't be able to get back out. So you can use your key to identify which animals or insects are inside. And then once you're done, you make sure that we release them again so they can get back to their natural habitat. And a pooter then, so this is used to collect small animals. One tube, and really important, it's the tube that doesn't have the gauze, is placed on or near the insect. And then the other tube, which will have a little gauze down at the end of it, is used to suck the insect into the collection jar. Really important that it's the one that doesn't have the gauze that goes over the insect, and the one that does have the gauze that goes into your mouth, because you don't want to accidentally suck an insect into your mouth. Now, we mentioned this already, but how do we actually identify the animals and plants? Well, we can use a key for that. So there's simple keys over here for identifying plants. We can see there's pictures, so you can compare what you have to what's on the key and maybe identify it. You can have more detailed keys as well, where you follow a route by answering yes or no questions to identify an animal. But most of them are going to be very simple and will have pictures, so it's really, really easy for you to identify what organisms you've collected. So we have an exam question here based on ecology and the pieces of equipment we just looked at. So the first one says, use some of the words in the list to name the pieces of equipment shown below, which can be used in a habitat study. So we have beating tray, pooter, net and pitfall trap. And we can see here there's a trap set into the ground. So that one there is our pitfall trap. And the next one, we know that there's two tubes there. One of them has a gauze down here as well, collecting small insects. So that there is our pooter. Now, part B. The students also used a quadrat during the habitat study. What shape is a quadrat? And describe how the students might have used it. So really important there just to recognise that there's two questions, not just one. So the first part is asking what shape is a quadrat. The second part is describe how they might have used it. Okay, so the first part of the answer there is that it's going to be a square. And now the next part, how did we use it? So we can say we threw a pencil over our shoulder, or throw a pencil over shoulder. We can then place our quadrat. On top, and record the names of the plants and animals. And that was with a key. And then you could say to calculate the frequency, but there's enough in 3 points there as well. Okay, so that's our first exam question, and we can see how we can relate our knowledge to the questions that come up. Important as well, just to make sure we're given enough detail down here. So, and we actually are answering the full question. So it's not just what shape is a quadrat, it's what shape and describe how it might be used. So because it said describe, we need to give a little bit more detail there. So make sure and try and fill the space if you can. So within your habitat study then, you would have carried out both a qualitative and a quantitative study. So a qualitative study is any data that uses words. So most likely you're recording yes or no answers. Was this organism present? Yes. Was this organism present? No. Okay, or you're naming them. So you might have got grass, you might have seen a dandelion, you might have seen a woodlouse. So it's anything to do with words. But quantitative data, so anything with quantities, that's any data using numbers. So you're counting the number of organisms that are present. You're calculating the percentage frequency. You're calculating the percentage cover. We have to use numbers for a quantitative study. So we would have done a habitat study similar to this. So a qualitative study, it basically is just recording whether an organism is present or not. So let's say, for example, we had grass, that was present. That's why I wrote it down. We might have had a dandelion. okay, where we're just recording names and whether it was present or not. You probably would have wrote in a little bit of equipment that you used to collect the particular animal or plant, and then we would have had a sketch over here of what it looks like as well. Numbers are not used, so we don't have to count them, and then if you did have access to the resource pack, you'll be able to see the habitat study details in there. A quantitative study then of plants and animals, this is where you actually do count them. So a quantitative study counts the number of organisms that are present. So you're saying, okay, there's an 80% chance that I'm going to get one on my next throw. There was 9 out of 10 throws a dandelion was there. So we're counting and we're performing calculations using numbers. It's not enough just to say yes or no. We have to use numbers in this case. Now, one calculation you can do as part of your quantitative study is to calculate the percentage frequency of an organism. And the percentage frequency gives an estimation of the chance that you would find a specific species when you throw a quadrat or use a piece of equipment, another piece of equipment in a habitat. So the percentage frequency is found by dividing the number of throws where an organism is present by the total number of throws and times them by 100 to change to a percentage. Now, what's that going to look like here? Well, in this particular example, a woodlouse was present on 6 out of the 10 throws, so the frequency was 6 out of 10, times that by 100, and it got 60%. If we were dealing with grass, we might have had something like that. So it was present 9 times, the frequency was 9 out of 10, so times that by 100, we had a 90% chance of getting on our next throw. So it doesn't matter what the particular organism is, plant or animal, count the number of throws it was present, divide by the total number of throws, and times by 100, that will give you your percentage frequency. So there's a 60% chance that we're going to get a woodlouse on our next throw, but a 90% chance that we're going to come across grass. Percentage cover is slightly different, and it's normally just done for plants. So I'll just write that in. So it's going to be based on plants for these examples, and this is an estimation as to what percentage of a habitat an organism takes up. Okay, so the percentage cover, this is where we're going to use the quadrat that's divided up into smaller squares. So something that might look a little bit like that. Not the best drawn, but you get the idea. It's the total number of small squares an organism was present in, divided by the total number of small squares across all throws, and we times that by 100. Okay, so the example we would have seen a couple of minutes ago had 25 small squares within the quadrat. This particular one here has 16, but it's usually going to be 25. Now, we can see another example here. So we counted the number of small squares this particular organism was present in. It was grass in this case. That particular plant. So in total it was present in 215 small squares. There's 25 small squares in the quadrat. We threw it 10 times, so in total there was 250 small squares. But we could do the same thing for a daisy. Let's say, for example, we had a daisy. We'll throw in some numbers here. This is the number of small squares it was present in. So we add up all those, so 30, 45, 65, 80, 90, 110, 125, 130, so it's present in 140 small squares out of 250. So we'd have 140 out of 250 times that by 100, and we will get 56%. So 56% of the habitat was covered in daisies. Okay, and again, it doesn't matter what organism you use, it will most likely be a plant. You can calculate the percentage cover. So here's another exam question here. So a group of students carried out a line transect study to show the distribution of the daisy, a common wildflower plant, in the grassland habitat. One end of a string was staked near the trunk of a tree and the other was staked 8 metres away. So this is the first one, second one was over here. The string had knots at 1 metre intervals. The number of daisy plants touching the string in each 1 metre interval is given in the table below. Station 1 was nearest the tree. So using the results in a table, draw a suitable graph to show the relationship between the number of daisy plants and the distance from the tree. So a bar chart is probably the most suitable for this. So we'll start that off. I'll actually just make that slightly smaller, just so we can fit it in. Now you're obviously going to use a ruler for this. And along the x-axis is going to be the stations, the y-axis is going to be the frequency. So we need to go up as far as 8 on the y-axis. I'm only going to do every second number just to make it a little bit neater. And along the bottom is going to be the number of daisy plants. So at the first station we had 0, so we can leave that blank. The second station had 2, so I'm going to do 2 boxes of an interval. The next one had 3. Then we had 5. Again, you'll be using a ruler. Station 5 had 7. Station 6 had 8. Station 7 had 7. And station 6 had 8 again. Station 8 had 6. So we label our stations along the bottom. So this was the number of plants along the y-axis. The station was along the bottom. I just can't fit it in at the bottom of the screen. We should write it in underneath the numbers. And if you want, you can add some colour to your bars as well, just to make them stand out. And we won't forget our title there as well. So that will be part of our success criteria. So we'll give a title over here. Number of daisies at each station, something like that. Okay, and that's perfect. So that's your bar chart drawn, 15 marks in your exam. Now we're going to focus on adaptations of organisms within the habitat now for a couple of minutes. So an adaptation is when an organism develops certain characteristics that will make it more suited to the environment that it lives in. Okay, so the example we can see over here is about the polar bear. A couple of adaptations it has white fur, so it's going to reflect or retain some of the heat. It's also going to camouflage it. And it also has thick layers of fat as well, just to keep it warm, because it obviously lives in very cold conditions. Now, it normally happens as a result of evolution, and there's two main types of adaptations. We have physical adaptations, and we also have behavioural adaptations as well. So an exam question then based off of adaptations, it says here that global warming can cause the melting of ice sheets and glaciers, which is partly responsible for rising sea levels. Ice sheets are the natural habitat of animals such as polar bears. So state one adaptation of polar bears that make them suited to this environment. So again, we have a couple of different examples here that we can use. So one of them is they're white. For camouflage, you can say that they have fat under the skin, so they have thick layers of fat. You could say that they have thick fur to keep them warm. You could mention that they have claws so that they can hunt. They have sharp teeth. So there's loads of different possible answers there. You only had to give one. Okay, so really important we just give one there, because that's what the question asked us. Would you expect the population of polar bears to increase or decrease as ice sheets melt? So we're not actually asked for a reason here. It's just increase or decrease. We would probably expect that to decrease, okay, because they have less place to live, probably have less food, so it becomes more difficult for them to survive. So we would say decrease. No explanation asked for there, just the word decrease. So that would have been 3 marks for each one of those. Okay, so a couple more adaptations then just before we move on. The polar bear had a physical adaptation, so they have white fur to protect or camouflage them from their prey. They also have thick layers of fat to keep them warm. Buffalo actually have a behavioural adaptation, so this is when we talked earlier on about migration. Buffalo migrate to areas with better weather, better breathing conditions, and also where the areas might have more food at certain times of the year. Squirrels also have a behavioural adaptation, so they hibernate, their metabolism is very low, so they enter a deep sleep to save their energy over winter, where they would find it very hard to find food. Okay, so again, it's a behavioural one. Squirrels will go into hibernation. We're now going to have a little look at competition. So we mentioned it briefly earlier on about how plants and animals can compete for different resources. But when we talk about competition, we're talking about the struggle between organisms for things that are in short supply, okay, or in limited supply. That could be food, it could be water, it could be mates, it could be oxygen, it could be light. So the last two in particular are most related to plants, but it could be for everything. So it can take place between different species, but it can also take place from organisms from the same species. So we can see up here we have our two organisms up here, our two animals, they're from the same species, but similarly this could happen between one from one species and another from another species. It can take place in both scenarios there. So for example, male deer will compete for mates, they could compete for food, and plants will compete for space and for light, they could compete for water as well. So lots of examples of competition that exist. Now, interdependence, really important here when we're talking about interdependence, that we always give the two sides of the story, and I'll get to that in a minute. So interdependence refers to when two organisms depend on each other for survival. So two organisms depend on each other for survival. It's a two-way process, and that's really important. So the example we have here at the bottom says, bees rely on plants for pollen to make honey. Plants need the bees to transfer this pollen to the other plants to reproduce. So it's not just enough to say that bees rely on plants for pollen to make honey. That's just one side of the story. You need to give the other side as well. So what do the plants do for the bees? What do the bees do for the plants? Okay, so again, the bees rely on plants for pollen to make honey, but the plants need the bees to transfer some of their pollen to other plants so that they can reproduce. So if you're ever given an example of interdependence, make sure you're given both sides of the story, because if an exam question comes up on it, you won't get your 3 marks unless you give both ways. Okay, so really, really important on that. So here's another example of an exam question which has come up. So the results of a student's habitat study were displayed on a bar chart. Name a piece of equipment or apparatus which could have been used to measure plant frequency. So the one we seen a couple of minutes ago was a quadrash. Depending on what you use in your own school, you could also have said a line transect. Most students will use the quadrash, but the line transect is 100% perfect as well. What could the student have used to identify the plants? So we would use a key. We've mentioned that a few times. Use a key for your plants and your animals. The student noticed that the dandelions had deeper roots than the grass. Name one resource for which the roots of dandelions and grass compete. So they can compete for water. So we get our marks for that. If we wanted another acceptable answer, we only will write down one though, because that's all we need. They do also compete for minerals. They also compete for nutrients. And they can compete for space as well. Okay, but again, we only need one resource there, so just make sure we're just writing down the one. Now, we're not going to have a look at the next part, okay, because we don't need to look at that anymore. That's from the old course. But describe an example of how plants and animals can show interdependence. So any example here, what did we mention a couple of minutes ago? So bees rely on plants for pollen to make honey. And I'm going to do this one just further back up because I'm running out of space. You can say plants need bees, so important to give both sides of the story in a different colour here, to transfer pollen for reproduction. So the big one there, really important, we're given both sides of the story there for that last one, because you won't actually get your 3 marks unless you give both ways. Okay, so to finish up with for today, we're going to look at energy flow, food chains, food webs. So energy will flow throughout an ecosystem as organisms feed. Okay, so any organism that makes their own food is called a producer. So any plant is normally a producer, makes their own food. And organisms that eat other organisms are called consumers. So the leaf here is our producer. Everything else after that is our consumer. Okay, the arrow will always point to what's doing the eating or doing the consuming. So the caterpillar eats the leaf, the chameleon eats the caterpillar, the snake eats the chameleon, the mongoose eats the snake. Okay, normally a food chain, which we'll get to in a second, which is what this is over here, we'll just have one continuous line. So after the chameleon, we go over to the snake and then go over to the mongoose. We were just running out of space here, so that's why it came back down. They can be represented like this as well, but more often than not, it's just going to be a continuous straight line. So what organisms do we have in our habitats? Well, we're going to have our producer, we're going to have our primary consumer, and this is our first consumer. So that's the one that eats the producer. We have our secondary consumer, that's the one that eats the primary consumer. And then the tertiary consumer is the one that eats the secondary consumer. So it's always eaten the level before. Now it says here that the tertiary consumer is normally the top consumer. That's suggesting that the food chains normally wouldn't go any further than the tertiary consumer. And a lot of the time that will be true. We'll get to why that is in a couple of minutes, but it's to do with the amount of energy that's lost as one organism eats another. Now, consumers can either be carnivores, which means they only eat meat. They can be herbivores, which means they can only eat plants. Or they can be omnivores, and that means they eat both meat and plants. Okay, so if we have a look at a couple of examples here, we have a rabbit will eat the green plant, a fox can eat the rabbit, a sparrowhawk can eat the fox. Exact same way, we can have a green fly eats the green plants, a ladybird will eat the green fly, a sparrowhawk then again could eat the ladybird. So a couple of examples of food chains there. Now, a food chain will show the relationship or the feeding relationship between the organisms in a habitat, and really important that the arrow points towards the organism that does the consuming. So they'll usually start with our producer and then are consumed by consumers. So primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. In this case, we actually have a fourth consumer, but normally we'll only go as far as the third consumer just because of the amount of energy that's lost. Now, a food web is very similar because this is just made up of numerous food chains. Okay, so a food web is made up of interconnected food chains. The food web will show us all of the organisms are reliant on each other for survival. So let's have a look for a couple of food chains. We've our plant here is eaten by the giraffe, is eaten by the lion, but the exact same way that plant can be eaten by a rhino and then that rhino eaten by a lion. So there's two different food sources there for the lion, but only one food source each for the giraffe and for the rhinoceros. That's really advantageous for the lion actually, because if the number of giraffes were to fall, it's not going to lose its only food source, it still has a food source that it can rely on. Kind of can be troublesome for the giraffe and the rhino there, because if the number of these plants went down, their food source is going to really be diminished, and because they're competing with another organism for that food, they could run out of it and eventually face starvation, or they could die. So other food chains over here, we could look for a long one. So we start off with the plant, go to the grasshopper, go to the bird, go to the, looks like a skunk, and then go to the hawk. Okay, exact same way here, we go to the mouse, continue the whole way up, another example of a food chain. So anytime you see two arrows coming out of an organism, that means that there's someone competing for that. So if we have a look here at this, we have this particular organism here, grasshopper, that's competed for by two different organisms. Okay, if we have a look at this plant down here, we can see it has 1, 2, 3, 4. So we actually have 4 different organisms competing for that one. So we're looking for 2 arrows coming out of it if there's going to be competition there. Okay, so we mentioned there a couple of minutes ago about how the food chains are normally quite short, and normally the tertiary consumer or the third consumer is going to be as far as it gets. And that's because energy will flow throughout the ecosystems as organisms feed. But almost all of that energy is going to be lost as we move through the food pyramid, okay, or the food chain. So roughly 90% of the energy is going to be lost each time. So we start off with a large amount of energy. Plants make their own food from the sun. Large amount of energy is going to be produced. The primary consumer is going to eat the producer. They will get some of that energy, but roughly about 90% is going to be lost, and that's going to be lost as heat energy. When that secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, it's going to get some of the energy, but again, roughly 90% of that energy is going to be lost. That's going to be lost as heat. So by the time you get up here to the tertiary consumer, very, very little energy is left. So we generally don't go any further in the food chain than that. Okay, so our last exam question for today. Below is an example of a food chain from a garden habitat. So the rose bush is eaten by the green fly, is eaten by the ladybird, is eaten by the spider. What word describes the role of the rose bush in this food chain? So it produces its own food, so that's our producer. Okay, it's the first organism in the food chain. That's our producer. Explain what would happen to the size of the spider population in this habitat if all of the rose bushes died. Well, most likely it's going to decrease. And why is that? Well, if the number of rose bushes went down, or was to fall because they died, the green flies are going to run out of a food source. Okay, so they're not going to be able to eat as much if they were totally reliant on that, so they could die off. That means the ladybirds could die off because their food source is dying off. And if the ladybirds are dying off, that means the spider is going to have reduced food sources, so they would most likely decrease as well. So just to finish off for today, I'm just going to take you through the ExamRevision website. So just for all the content that we went through today and much, much more, I'll show you where you can access it. So at the minute we're set to junior cycle science, but we can see there's loads of different subjects there for junior cycle. So we've junior cycle business, we've geography, we've home ec, we've Irish, we've maths, and we've science. And they all have the exact same layout. So within junior cycle science, if we press on video tutorials, there's video tutorials there on the entire course. So today we are looking at the biological world. So if we scroll down, we are looking at biological world 5. So there's a video there talking you through how you can carry out your habitat study, and also one there on competition, adaptations, and interdependence. There is an MCQ quiz, so once we tap into that, we can see there's 12 questions there to answer, so you can press through all of the answers and get a score at the end, and you can do that as many times as you want until you get 100%. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further, we can press into biological world 1. We do have PowerPoint presentations there as well on all of the topics within junior cycle science, so it'll take a minute or two to load up, but we'll see then a PowerPoint presentation will appear, and you can flick through that as well and pick up even more notes. We do also have the option towards the bottom of an exam builder. So at the minute here, we're looking at biological world 1, so living things in the cell. So all you have to do is flick through the questions, whichever ones you want to add to an exam for yourself, you press the plus button, and when you go back up to the top, there's an option there to download the questions and the answers, and you can test yourself. So these are all former exam questions from the actual state exams and then from mocks as well. So you can really test yourself and make sure you know these topics inside out and upside down. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more information, when you first go to the website when you're not signed in, there is an option up there for plans and pricing. So you can have a flick through it yourself. There's 3 different accounts. There's a free account, a standard plan, and a premium plan. There is an option to sign up for monthly subscriptions, and the more subjects that you sign up for, the cheaper it's going to be. Okay, so the first subject will be full price. Every subject after that, you will get a little bit of a discount. So other than that, thanks a million for joining the Saturday session today. Make sure and follow us on all of our social media, so Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. We'll have lots more of these Saturday sessions coming up throughout the year. So just make sure to like and subscribe. Set a reminder for every Saturday at 11 a.m. You'll be able to tune in for all of the subjects that we mentioned earlier on and make sure that you're fully set for your exam next June. So thanks a million for joining in, guys, and I will see you again soon.